Hello everyone, and welcome back to Think Academy's AP Language course. We are now on lesson 4, and this will be the final lesson that focuses on the free response questions. So we've talked about the argument essay, we've talked about the rhetorical analysis essay. Now we are going to talk about the synthesis essay, which is actually the first essay you come across. If you decide to do them in order, you can do them in any order you want, but it is the first one that you'll see on the test. And the reason we've saved it for last is because it incorporates a lot of the same ideas as the argument essay, with the big difference being that you have sources to get your evidence from. So we're going to spend a majority of today talking about how to use those sources and how to incorporate those sources into your essay. But as always, we're going to go over the rubric. And after we've talked about the synthesis essay, we're going to try to put all of the concepts we've talked about for the free response questions together and do some actual essay writing practice. So, like I mentioned, the synthesis essay is similar to the argument essay. You are still trying to formulate an argument. However, you're not formulating your own argument. You are creating an argument based on information provided by the test. And then once you've created that argument, you also have to support that argument with evidence from the information that's provided by the test. So everything that you write in the synthesis essay, I don't want to say comes from the sources, right? Because you do want to have your own voice. You don't want to just be copying from the sources. But the basis of your entire argument will come from the sources. Your thesis is going to be something that you choose based on the information that's provided to you. You're going to support your thesis with claims and evidence from those sources, etc. It's very similar in structure and approach to the argument essay, in the sense that you have to pick a clear side. You're taking a clear position, and you're trying to persuade the audience that your position is correct. And like I mentioned earlier, the key difference is that all the evidence must come from the provided sources. So since it is similar to the argument essay in that way, that you are picking a side and that you're trying to persuade the audience to agree with your side, all of those kind of methods of persuasion or building an argument ideas that we talked about in the argument essay can be useful here. Things like using strong and specific diction and syntax, things like using rhetorical appeals, any of the concepts we talked about in the argument essay. If you want to go back to that video, if you need a refresher, those things can all come into play for the synthesis essay as well. So let's take a look at the rubric. There isn't going to be a whole lot that's new here. Most of this you should already be familiar with based on the past two rubrics we've looked at. A lot of it is very similar. I also want to keep in mind, if you are kind of taking the chance to pause and read over some of these examples, these relate to a specific prompt. So when it's talking about STEM education, that's just what the prompt was about. Obviously, your prompt probably won't be about STEM education, so you can just kind of ignore that or just substitute in whatever the topic may be for whenever it talks about STEM education. But the thesis point is exactly the same as the argument essay. You need to present a thesis. That thesis statement needs to respond to the prompt, and it needs to clearly take a position that's defensible, right? A position that can be supported by evidence. Exactly the same as the argument essay. Evidence and commentary is mostly the same as well. It still talks about providing specific evidence and providing commentary that explains how the evidence supports your line of reasoning. But the big difference here is that in order to earn all 4 points, you must provide evidence from at least 3 sources. So if we look a little closer here, 4 points, that's the maximum. Provide specific evidence from at least 3 of the provided sources to support all claims. So if you don't have evidence from at least 3 sources, you cannot get all of the points for evidence and commentary. You can't even get 3 of the points, actually, because 3 points also provide specific evidence from at least 3 of the provided sources. 2 points provides evidence from or references at least 3 of the provided sources. 1 point provides evidence from or references at least 2 of the provided sources. So if you only reference 2 sources, the most you can get is 1 point for evidence and commentary. That means 50% is the highest score you can get for your synthesis essay. The most you could possibly get is 3 out of 6 points if you only reference or cite 2 sources. In order to get even 4 of the 6 points for this essay, you need to use evidence from at least 3 sources. Very, very important. You must incorporate at least 3 sources. And if you don't even, if you do less than 2 sources, if you only do 1 source or no sources, you won't get a single point for evidence and commentary, regardless of how strong the evidence is, or regardless of how good your commentary is. The points here are kind of heavily dependent on using at least 3 sources. And then from there, that's like the bare minimum, right? And then once you do that, then it kind of goes up on the scale that's similar to the argument essay based on how strong or how specific your evidence is and how effective you are at employing commentary. The sophistication point is also very similar to what we've seen before. The tips and strategies that we talked about in the previous lesson are applicable to all 3 essays, so those same ideas, you're going to want to use them here as well. Things like varying your sentence structure, making use of synonyms instead of repeating the same word over and over again, strong and specific diction and syntax, using rhetorical devices or strategies in your writing, and anything else we talked about in the previous lesson. That is going to help you earn the sophistication point on your synthesis essay as well. So let's talk about this 15 minutes of reading time. This is something I believe I briefly mentioned in lesson 1, and we haven't talked about it since. You technically, according to the way that the test format is written, technically you have 40 minutes per essay and then 15 minutes of reading time. Now, you're not actually limited to that, right? It's not that you have to spend 15 minutes of reading time before you're allowed to start writing or anything like that. You can use that time however you want. You have 45 minutes per essay in total. However, they recommend that 15 minutes is reading time. I'm not saying that you have to use 15 minutes or that you should use more than 15 minutes or less than 15 minutes. I'm not too concerned about the 15 minutes itself, but the reason why this time exists is because of the synthesis essay, and I guess to a lesser extent the rhetorical analysis essay as well. The rhetorical analysis essay has a passage you have to read, but it's mostly so that you have extra time to look through the sources. And before you start writing your synthesis essay, you should do that. You should look through the sources. You should see what you're working with, because what you write is heavily dependent on what the sources tell you, what information you have available to you. But we have a specific way I recommend looking at them, and we'll talk about that in a second. Obviously, we want to read the prompt first before we read the sources. That way we know what the topic is, what we're writing about, what we're choosing a position on. And then after you identify the topic, then you can go to the sources. And unlike the argument essay, you are limited to the information that is provided by the test. You do not want to use any outside evidence. Even if you have outside evidence, you're like, wow, this would be great to put in my essay. Don't do it. Just use the information from the sources. That's what the purpose of this essay is. The purpose of this essay is to test how good you are at taking information that's given to you and incorporating it into your writing. They don't want you to use outside information for this essay. For the argument essay, yes. For this one, no. And because of that, there is a finite amount of evidence to support each position, right? Because you are limited to what the test provides, you have a limited number of pieces of evidence that you can use. Because of that, it is best to choose the position that you feel most comfortable arguing, not based on your personal opinion, right? Not based on what you personally believe, but based on the information provided to you by the sources. So whichever position you have more evidence for, or more evidence that you can more easily incorporate into an essay for, that's the position you should write about. You should not argue a position if only one of the 6 or 7 sources supports that position. It's going to be very, very difficult to do that, especially since you must use at least 3 sources. So you're going to want to look at the sources first before you've even chosen a position. Identify what's going on in the sources, and then use that information to decide what position you are writing about. So let's talk about the sources and how we want to approach the sources and deal with the sources. Your goal for this first read through or look through of the sources is to quickly identify the main idea of each source and which position each source supports relative to what the prompt is asking. So, for example, if the prompt wants you to choose a position on whether or not, let's go with the self-driving cars example I've used a million times. The prompt wants you to choose a position on whether or not self-driving cars are worth investing in. You are going to want to look through each of your sources and quickly identify what the main idea is, right? Main idea is an idea you should be familiar with, the main point, the main concept, what the source is talking about mostly of each source, and then which position it supports based on what the prompt is asking. So if the prompt is saying, should we or should we not invest in self-driving car technology, you should be able to identify, okay, this source says we should, this one says we shouldn't, this one says we should, this one says we shouldn't, etc. And that's going to help you figure out which sources are most helpful to you based on the position you choose. So once you've done this, once you've identified the main idea and the position that each source supports, you can determine which position there's the most evidence for and which sources you can use to support your position, which sources you can use to address an opposing viewpoint if you decide to do that, and then which sources you don't need to use at all. You don't need to use all of them. You only need to use 3. Most of the time, this is not all of the time. Most of the time, you will get 6 sources. Sometimes you'll have 7. Most of the time, you'll have 6 sources. And most of the time, 3 of them will support one position, 3 of them will support another position. And in that case, right, you do have a little bit of leeway on which position you choose. Both of them are possible. You're going to want to choose which one you think would be easiest for you to argue based on the evidence that's given to you, or easiest for you to support based on the evidence that's given to you. In the case where you have 7 and 4 of them support one position and 3 of them support the other, I would choose the one that has 4. If there's ever a scenario where 4 of them support one position and 2 of them supports another one, you're definitely going to want to pick the one that has 4, right? Because if only 2 sources support your position, it's going to be hard to incorporate at least 3 sources. So yeah, once you've identified this, then choose your position. And then because you've identified the position and the main idea of each of them, you can say, okay, I know these are going to be my 3 main sources that support my position, or the 4 main sources that support my position. I know that if I want to incorporate an opposing viewpoint, maybe I use this one. Or if I don't incorporate an opposing viewpoint, I know that I can completely ignore these 3 sources, or these 2 sources for the entire rest of my essay. And the reason we do this, right, is because it makes it a lot easier and quicker to incorporate sources when we start writing, rather than scrambling and trying to find stuff while we're writing. So I have a specific method here that I recommend that accomplishes this goal of quickly identifying the main idea and position of each source. You can read through all of the sources, however, that's not always the quickest way to do it. And I found this method to be quicker and consistent, reliable. So here is my 4-step method for identifying the main idea and position of each source. So we start with step 0. This is actually technically not part of the 4-step method, but the first step that you should do is identify what the prompt is asking you to do, right? You want to read the prompt and you want to know what type of position are you taking. And this is really important because you need to identify the position of each source relative to what the prompt is asking. So for example, I'll actually use this as an example. We're going to be looking through this prompt and sources from this prompt a lot throughout this lesson. Let's read this, and I'll give you an example of why this is really important. In response to our society's increasing demand for energy, large-scale wind power has drawn attention from governments and consumers as a potential alternative to traditional materials that fuel our power grids, such as coal, oil, natural gas, water, or even newer sources such as nuclear or solar power. Yet the establishment of large-scale commercial-grade wind farms, I'm going to zoom in to make this a little easier to see. Large-scale commercial-grade wind farms is often the subject of controversy for a variety of reasons. Carefully read the following 6 sources, including the introductory information for each source. Then, synthesize material from at least 3 of the sources and incorporate it into a coherent, well-written essay in which you develop your position on the most important factors that an individual or agency should consider when deciding whether to establish a wind farm. Your argument should be the focus of your essay. Use the sources to develop your argument and explain the reasoning for it. Avoid merely summarizing the sources. Indicate clearly which sources you are drawing from, whether through direct quotation, paraphrase, or summary. You may cite the sources as source A, source B, etc., or by using the descriptions in parentheses. Okay. Sorry about that background noise. I think one of the neighbors is like, I don't even know what they're doing, but very loud. Okay. So, it wants to know, this prompt is asking you to choose a position on the most important factors that an individual or agency should consider when deciding whether to establish a wind farm. It's a little more open-ended, right? So it might be, okay, it's not asking you, are wind farms good or bad, right? It's not asking you to choose a position on whether you think wind farms are a good thing or a bad thing. Right? So when you're looking through these sources, they might have a position on whether wind farms are good or bad. You don't care about that. You're not going to write down, okay, the position is that wind farms are good. The position is that wind farms are bad. Because that's not what you're going to be writing about. You want to identify the position relative to what the prompt is asking. And the prompt wants to know what the most important factors are that should be considered. So when you're reading through these, you want to say, okay, the position of this one is that the most important factor is this, or the most important factor is that. That's why it's so important to read the prompt first before you look at the sources, because you need to know what the position, like what the topic is that you are identifying a position for. So that's step 0, very important. Once you've done that, once you've figured out what the topic is that we're developing a position for, now we can start our 4-step process of identifying the main idea and position of each source. So step 1 is to read the box and the italics. And this is the introductory information that the prompt mentions. The box and the italics are going to provide you with the title of this work, the author a lot of the time, where it came from, some background information, some context about what's going on. A lot of that stuff we talked about with the rhetorical situation, right? It's going to give you a lot of information, which can give you an immediate idea of the type of information that's in the source. It's not necessarily going to give you the main idea right away, but it's going to kind of set you up in a way that you can get a head start on what this source is likely to talk about. So source B is Julia Layton, How Wind Power Works, from How Stuff Works, August 9th, 2006. And it says the following is excerpted, I always struggle to say that word, excerpted from a popular website dedicated to explaining various processes. Okay, so we've read that, and from that we can kind of tell, all right, we're dealing with an explanation here, right? This is going to be explaining how wind power works, right? We know that from the title, and also from the italics. It's a website dedicated to explaining various processes. So we know this information in this source is likely going to be informative, instructional, educational, right? It's going to be trying to explain how wind power works. Step 2. Read the first and last paragraphs. So we have kind of this introductory information done that sets us up for what we're about to read. Then we want to read the first paragraph and then the last paragraph. And the reason we do this is they are the most likely places to contain a straightforward declaration of the main idea, right? Think about your writing. Your thesis statement's in the first paragraph, right? Your conclusion ties everything back to the thesis statement. So if we have an introduction, if we have a conclusion, we might find a very straightforward main idea just in there. Now, this isn't always the case because sometimes our sources are excerpts from longer works. Therefore, the first paragraph and last paragraph that we're given are not actually the introduction and the conclusion of the entire work. But it's still... Well, step 3 kind of covers that. Step 3 kind of makes up for that. But a lot of the time, not a lot of the time, sometimes right away just from this first and last paragraph, we'll be able to identify that main idea. So let's give those a read here. On a global scale, wind turbines are currently generating about as much electricity as 8 large nuclear power plants. This includes not only utility-scale turbines, but also small turbines generating electricity for individual homes or businesses, sometimes used in conjunction with photovoltaic solar energy. A small 10 kilowatt capacity turbine can generate up to 16,000 kilowatt hours per year. A typical US household income consumes about 10,000 kilowatt hours in a year. I totally guessed on the units there. I'm pretty sure that's what they stand for, but I'm not super knowledgeable about electricity. And then the last paragraph says, the current total electricity generation in the United States is in the area of 3.6 trillion kilowatt hours every year. Wind has the potential to generate far more than 1% of that electricity. So, from what we've read here, it's talking a lot about wind turbines and how they're able to generate a lot of electricity, and it talks about how, how much electricity U.S. households use and how much electricity the entire United States uses. And it talks about how wind has the potential to generate a lot of electricity. So I'm kind of starting to think that the main idea here might have something to do with how wind turbines are able to produce a lot of electricity, and maybe the position has something to do with the most important factor being how much energy they're able to produce. That's kind of where I'm leaning right now.